afternoon. I'm Krisan Ashkate. Welcome to APTN National News. Thank you for joining us. After 2 years of work and countless interviews with Indigenous communities, Special Interlocutor for Missing Children, Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites, Kimberly Murray, released her final report on Tuesday. APTN's Fraser Needham has that story.
Murray's final report contains a total of 42 obligations for governments and institutions like the Catholic Church and RCMP. But the Special Interlocutor says the most important obligation is to residential school survivors themselves.
The greatest and most important obligation that we all have is to the survivors. They must be honored and acknowledged for their courage, determination, and advocacy to raise public awareness about the truths of unmarked burials of children. Survivors have shared these truths for decades, but their testimonies have been dismissed or ignored.
Some of the key obligations call on the federal government to establish a national Indigenous-led commission of investigation into missing children and unmarked burials, provide long-term sufficient and flexible funding for searches, and fight Indian residential school denialism and rewrite Canada's history. Murray says the disappearance of Indigenous children while attending residential schools was no mistake. She stresses that it was the result of what she calls a Canadian policy of enforced disappearances.
These children did not just vanish. They were not disappeared by accident. The forced removal and transfer of Indigenous children was Canadian law and Canadian policy. Those in charge of these institutions knew that the children's chances of surviving were low. They exposed the children to diseases that killed them, refused to provide them with enough food, and permitted non-consensual human experimentation to be conducted on them.
Justice Minister Araf Virani was also on hand when the report was released in Gatineau, Quebec. He says the federal government will now carefully review its obligations.
While today's gathering marks a closure in some ways, it is by no means an ending. It is a milestone, instead, in our ongoing efforts to address the intergenerational trauma of residential schools.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Leaders of members of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation were at the Alberta Legislature on Tuesday morning to greet the visiting Governor-General of Canada, Mary Simon. They are asking for the federal government to honor the treaties. APTN's Chris Stewart has more.
Over 100 people, mostly from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, gathered outside the Alberta Legislature to ask Governor-General Mary Simon for talks to have the federal government live up to the treaties. This is the final day of the Governor-General's 5-day visit to Alberta. At 10 a.m., the first Indigenous Governor-General of Canada arrived outside the legislature. She was greeted by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. People here drove 2 hours to attend. Saddle Lake Cree Nation Chief says the government has not done enough to honor the treaties.
We're here today to make our stance. We want to allow the people to know that ever since 1876 we've honored our treaty rights and we respected the signing of it. So, and in saying that, now we're asking them to do their part in honoring their part and looking after us as treaty people.
Chief Whiskey Jack wants to have a sit-down with the Governor-General to discuss these issues.
I do want a one-on-one with her in the near future because, like I said, we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot of issues that we need to deal with when it comes to our treaty rights, who are actually getting slowly stripped away from us without consulting us. So we want to make that stance and give her the message loud and clear.
The chief says all treaty nations need more from the government.
You could see the concern of our nation, and we're doing it, for all the Indian people who believe in their treaties. And we want to, send our prayers out to everybody who goes through difficulties in times like this.
And there is good news. An official told APTN that the Governor General is meeting with the Saddle Lake and leaders from Treaty 6, 7, and 8 and Matey leaders. Chief Whiskey Jack says it's true. We'll have more on this story in the coming days. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
A national conference is underway in Vancouver this week with stakeholders, frontline workers, and leaders who work within the child welfare system. APTN's Tina House reports.
Parliament embarked on a process of legislative reconciliation by means of an innovative statute. Under this statute, Indigenous governing bodies and the Government of Canada will work together to remedy the harms of the past and create a solid foundation for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship in the area of child and family services.
Over 1,600 people are here to discuss how to improve the lives of thousands of Indigenous kids who are in the child welfare system across Canada. Mary T.G. Gray is the chair for Our Children Our Way Society, and she says more funding in the area of prevention is helping kids stay with families and communities.
We've always had the jurisdiction to take care of our children. What we haven't had are the resources until now. So this Our Children Our Way conference is really to get practitioners, people that are on the ground, like our leaders, our elders, and social workers, and everybody coming together to say, what is a best practice? What can we learn from each other? It's very exciting.
Trish Nazil is the team lead for the Annabit program for the Office of the Wet'suwet'en Nation based in northern BC. Nazil says she's excited to see positive changes for kids in care.
Well, right now I've got to keep my finger on 250 plus families that we work with across the province and reintegrating them back into our Wet'suwet'en ways by way of culture camps or having family dinners in the urban centers. We have many families that didn't even know that they had cousins, first cousins in the same city. So I'm finding that really empowering, giving the children, that Wet'suwet'en children we work with, a strong sense of belonging, who they are and where they come from.
Palahelsia Lorelei Williams works with single moms. She says many lose their homes after their kids are taken away because in supportive housing, you can't stay in a 2 to 3 bedroom suite if the children don't reside with the parent.
When a mother comes to me, she loses everything. It's not just her child, she loses her home, she loses her money, she can't find a full-time job because she has to go to programs to try to get her kids back, but then she needs to try to find money to get a home. It's just such a vicious cycle.
Indigenous kids make up 53.8% of kids in care across Canada. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
The Comox Valley Regional District in BC is apologizing to the Comox First Nation this week for damaging several of its cultural heritage sites. The damage happened last year during the construction of the Denman Cross Island Trail that included building a 3.5-kilometer gravel trail that stretched east to west on the island. The district said it caused unnecessary harm and the damage could have been prevented if proper procedures were followed. The First Nation on Vancouver Island and the district are now working closely to prevent similar incidents from happening. They are also starting to work on fixing the damage. The district says they will help the First Nation pay for the repairs. Saskatchewan RCMP have confirmed they found human remains near Lloydminster earlier this week. On Monday, October 28th, Maidstone RCMP received a report that human remains was found in a rural area in the RM of Britannia. It's a large stretch of land northeast of Lloydminster between the city and the North Saskatchewan River. RCMP are now working with the Saskatchewan Coroner Service to identify the remains, as well as determine a cause of death. Maidstone RCMP have notified the families of missing persons in the area upon this discovery and will keep them updated as the investigation continues. A number of people have been reported missing from the nearby Onion Lake First Nation this year. The Matey Nation of Ontario is celebrating with a new Heritage Centre in Sault Ste. Marie. Mike McDonald will give us a tour when we're back in about 3 minutes. Stay with us. The Matey Nation of Ontario is celebrating what it calls a first-of-its-kind facility in the province. The MNO says the Sault Ste. Marie Métis Heritage Centre will serve as a permanent home for the stories, culture and history of the local Métis community. APTN's Mike McDonald reports.
The Sault Ste. Marie Métis Heritage Centre held its grand opening earlier this month. The councillor for the Huron-Superior Métis community in Northern Ontario is inviting everyone to see it.
Visitors can come in, learn about the history of the Métis community here, the history of the Pauli case, and then, community members can take part in workshops and, all sorts of things here on site.
The Pauli case is prominently featured at the centre, which is regarded by the Métis as a landmark legal victory that affirmed their rights. The Pauli exhibit also focuses on the life of Steve Pauli himself. Inside one display case rests a single Nielsen Jersey Milk chocolate bar. The story goes that Pauli, upon learning of his lawyer's sweet tooth, would have a Jersey Milk chocolate bar waiting for her at the beginning of every court date throughout the Pauli case.
So much of the story of the Pauli case gets wrapped up into the legal implications of it, and all of that's really important. But I never want us to lose sight of the fact that Steve was just a Métis guy trying to live his life and trying to feed his family, and that he was a real person.
I think it's incredibly exciting to see what the Métis community in Sault Ste. Marie have built.
Margaret Froh, president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, says the centre's grand opening comes during a turbulent time for the organization.
The story that is told in the new Sault Ste. Marie Métis Heritage Centre is a quintessential Métis story of resistance, of proud Métis communities, of acts of resistance, of just perseverance and resilience as the Crown continuously pushed us off land, pushed us out into the margins. But the community continued, not only survived, but is actively thriving.
I saw nothing but hundreds of smiling Métis faces who know their history, know their stories. They're not scared. They're, annoyed and disheartened a little bit by, the tone of the rhetoric. But, they're proud of who they are, and they know that they're not going away, and that this place will be the safe home for all those stories that give them that confidence.
Mike McDonald, APTN National News, Sault Ste. Marie.
With food prices continuing to rise, a Mi'kmaq culture-based butchery program is providing food security to 12 Indigenous women. Angel Moore brings us the story.
This is the second annual Nova Scotia Native Women's Association NSNWA butchery program. Participant Rianne Julian Sillyboy says learning to butcher meat will help her family.
I will know how to break it down so that we don't have to go to a butcher. We don't have to go somewhere and get someone else to do it for us. And this way we're able to use everything of the deer.
Caden Prosper says the 12 women were very enthusiastic under his direction.
They're just so pumped and they're eager. It almost reminded me of how kids are when it comes to seeing new things, and and when it came time to get the deer and after we shot it and we looked for it and found it, just how excited they were to get their hands dirty and just get in there.
The butchery program takes place at the new NSNWA building in Millbrook First Nation, about 90 kilometers northeast of Halifax. Employment Economic Development Director Justine Maloney says the program is long overdue.
Well, it means independence. It means, supplementing their income. It means just really able to sustain their families, their needs, and they're able to meet all of their needs, their families' needs, by being able to even go out and hunt first themselves.
Maloney says over 30 women are on the waiting list for next year, but the funding process is a barrier to success.
One of the kind of the barriers for us is that we do have to apply for this funding every single year.
As the women learn how to prepare and cut the deer, everything will be used, even the fat, to make homemade soap. The program is also about breaking norms. Julian Sillyboy says butchery is no longer a male-dominated profession.
They are very, very wrong. As I've seen today, our women can handle the saw, our women can handle the knife, our women can handle the meat, they can handle the shooting of it, cutting, skinning it. It's not a man's job, it's a person's job.
traditional food harvesting is becoming more common, and Prosper says more women are learning to hunt.
Like gender norms are like broken almost, and like we're going into like a new age of our women being strong along with our men, so we can go hand in hand. It doesn't have to be just the women doing everything, you know. Like I'm happy. It's super cool to see like everything that's going on here. And
however, Julian Sillyboy discovered she is not a good hunter.
I move a lot. I shuffle. I fidget. So I'm not very quiet out there. And I'm always wanting to ask questions, and we're trying to be quiet and not scare the deer away. And I'm sitting there rustling paper and picking off wood and making noise. So yeah, I've determined that I'll let somebody else do the hunting.
The butchery program will continue with tanning and end with a grandmother's feast. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Millbrook First Nation.
Indigenous youth got a big surprise this week thanks to a generous donation. These pictures were taken in the Greater Sudbury area, where 120 bags of hockey gear and 180 sticks were dropped off at the Northern Hockey Academy over the weekend. The hockey gear was then transported to Ottawapiskat, Sagamok, Wanapatei, and Kashechewan First Nations to help Indigenous youth in need. The Indigenous Hockey Equipment Drive gathers around 1,000 bags of gear per year for distribution for Indigenous communities across Ontario. We now want to tell you about this week's web poll question. Over on our website, we ask, do you support the creation of urban reserves in Canadian cities? Your answers are yes, no, or unsure. Go to aptnnews.ca to have your say. We'll have more on the final report from the special interlocutor for missing children, unmarked graves, and burial sites. Stay with us. Over on the east, Charlottetown 6, Fredericton 7. Anujuak 2, the Grand River 4. Gaspé 7, Saguenay 5. Peterborough 18, Sarnia 19. 16 in Sudbury, Wawa 16 as well. God's Lake 0, Pukatawagan -2. -4 in Dauphin, Brandon -6. -7 in Yorkton, North Battleford, -4. -3 in La Ronge, Stony Rapids, -10. -5 in Fort Chipewyan, Peace River, +2. 10 in Lethbridge, Calgary, 7. 9 in Penticton, Kamloops, 10. -3 in Fort Nelson, Dease Lake, +1. -3 in Watson Lake, Mayo, -5. -3 in Yellowknife, Fort Simpson, -6. Colville Lake, -7, Inuvik, -12. 0 in Baker Lake, Whale Cove, -1. And Clyde River 0, Agulik, -1. Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor for missing children, unmarked graves, and burial sites, is back to talk more about her final report and her findings. She recently spoke to us from Gatineau, Quebec. Here's that interview. Kimberly Murray, thank you so much for speaking with us. My first question for you is, you talk in your report about a policy of enforced disappearances. Can you explain what that is and what that means?
Absolutely. I wanted to really drive home in the report that we don't just have missing children, we have kids that have been disappeared by the state. Enforced disappearances happen when the liberty of a person is taken away from them and because of actions of the state. We know that the state created the Indian residential school policy and took the children and deprived them of their liberty. And the second part of enforced disappearances is that the state conceals the fate of the children. And so because we don't know what happened to the kids, because we have these laws that are blocking access to archives, the fate of the children is being concealed by the federal government. And so that's why I say that they are disappeared children. If the children are disappeared by the state, that triggers a number of international obligations on the state to provide proper mechanisms of investigation to find the children, to find the truth, to support the investigations for the missing and disappeared children.
Let's talk about that. One of your key recommendations is sustainable and ongoing federal government funding for searches. Why is this so important?
Well, we saw that play out in the summer when Canada cut the funding to the teams that are doing these investigations on the sites. We can't treat the search for missing and disappeared children as a program. Canada has legal obligations, international legal obligations to support these investigations. And we can't have Canada do the investigations. They can't investigate their own wrongdoing. And that's why we need an Indigenous-led commission of investigations to support communities doing these types of searches and investigations into the missing and disappeared children.
Why is that important to set up an Indigenous-led commission of investigation for these searches?
Well, we know that the investigation processes that we have in Canada and the provinces have all failed Indigenous people. There's a whole chapter in my final report that talks about the failed investigations while the Indian residential schools were operating, how very little was ever done when a child died. There was very few investigations of their deaths. When perpetrators were known to have existed, they weren't prosecuted and they were moved around to other residential schools or even out of the country. We can't rely on the death investigation systems that we have, and so we need a new mechanism, a new truth recovery mechanism, and it has to be Indigenous-led. That can apply Indigenous laws, recognize Indigenous sovereignty, and comply with international human rights processes.
Finally, Kimberly, what impact will your work have on the survivor community?
Well, what I really wanted to do with this report was to make sure their voices were captured at the 6 national gatherings that I held. I showed that video before I released the public report, and I think you saw all the messages that I write about in my report were messages that I heard from the survivors and community members at the national gatherings. So I wanted to make sure they understood that I've been listening to what they've been telling me, and I've been following their direction around what the obligations Canada has. I wanted to create a document, a report that I can hand to community members where a lot of the preliminary research and work has been done, that they can look at these other avenues for justice and accountability. And I hope I've been able to do that in a little way at least.
Kimberly, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. That's Special Interlocutor for Missing Children, Unmarked Graves, and Burial Sites, Kimberly Murray. Thanks for this.
No.
And that's your midday newscast for this Wednesday, October 30th. We'll be back again for your evening newscast with more brand new stories. Make sure to join us again. For everyone at APTN National News, hi miigwech, masicho, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again. We'll leave you now with some special Halloween sights.